Hi there. So I wanted to spend a little time giving some background about the Vietnam War. That way, when we talk about the anti-Vietnam movement and anti-Vietnam public opinion, we have this background information. So the way I want to start is by looking at it in two different ways. First would be like the American view, which would be the view of American policymakers, and then I'll kind of look at it, what I'll call the Vietnam view, which is more like from the ground, what it would have looked like from the perspective of people in Vietnam. So when I say the American view, I'm talking about how Vietnam was part of a broader U.S. foreign policy that was oriented towards the Soviet Union. The logic was we had to contain the spread of communist ideology and the spread of Soviet influence and keep it in places where it already was. Now, it had already spread to Eastern Europe. It had already spread to China by 1950, and we were in a war in Korea by the early 1950s. And so when Americans looked at Vietnam, they saw a potential place that communism could take over, and in fact had already made substantial inroads. And so our goal in eventually fighting, but at first at least trying to influence Vietnam, was to contain the spread of communism. This worked in two ways. All right, first, we needed to bolster up France. We wanted to make sure France, which had the colonial power in Southeast Asia, was not destabilized. Because if it was destabilized, maybe communism goes directly to France in Europe. Furthermore, we wanted to control it in Southeast Asia. That is, if communism spreads and takes root in Vietnam, who knows what's next? We have a set of dominoes up on the screen. This is called the domino theory. Next, it'll be in Thailand. Next, it'll be in Cambodia, and so forth. And generally, this is part of U.S. foreign policy, which views a lot of situations throughout the world as products of monolithic communism, as the Kremlin influencing all over the world. And you know the sort of the tone in my voice, which is skeptical, but that shouldn't confuse the fact that this was a really common point of view at the time. Furthermore, I'll add, from the American point of view, is that once we got involved in Vietnam, it would be very hard to get uninvolved in Vietnam without sort of admitting defeat. And a lot of American politicians were worried about losing in Vietnam and therefore continued to push. On the other hand, we could say it looked a little differently from the ground. From Vietnam's point of view, this is an anti-colonialist effort. So during World War II, Vietnam was controlled by Japan, who is expanding. Before that, it had been controlled by France, and then after World War II, when Japan's defeated, France goes back in charge. The U.S. and other allied powers had supported Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist-affiliated kind of freedom fighter when it was under Japanese control. But Ho Chi Minh, after the war, is a threat since we want to have France regain control over the region. And while Ho definitely saw the revolutionary potential of Marxism and communism, it's easy to argue that he was a patriot first. In fact, he himself said, "It was patriotism, not communism, that inspired me." Ho's popularity owed not to funding, which he did receive from the Soviets and the Chinese, but more to the inherent popularity of the idea of self-governance after centuries of rule by outside powers, whether it be the Europeans or whether it be the Chinese. And the idea of throwing off the colonialists is a very popular idea. And as we'll see, no matter how much money we can throw into Vietnam, no matter how many troops we can throw into Vietnam, it's a tough matchup against nationalism and the cultural differences. So we have a sort of progression of involvement that comes after World War II, and it starts with us supporting the French. And at one point, Ho Chi Minh is able to get enough of a foothold in the north that the French agree to split North and South Vietnam. Now, the idea would be is that there would be another set of elections in a couple of years, but the French are kind of bowing out at this point because it's too expensive to maintain their colonial mission. I think this is around 1953. So if communists are controlling the North, we want someone who's more friendly to the U.S. in the South, and particularly anti-communist. And we find that in a career bureaucrat named Diem. And Diem is anti-communist. He's Catholic and French. However, he lacks popular support, in no small part because he wanted very strong authority over his realm, and he and his secret police repressed his own people a good deal. And while many communists do move to the north, once the North Vietnam is communist controlled, many communists stay in the south as a sort of internal resistance, and they join with other resistors against Diem. Over time, Diem gets continually more and more unpopular, and eventually there's enough popular resistance that the U.S. basically withdraws its support from Diem and basically gives its blessing to a coup to overthrow Diem. From here on out, South Vietnam is going to be led by various leaders, but it's just a rotating cast of unpopular regimes that are propped up by the Americans. And from this point onward, the Kennedy administration, as we get into the 1960s, are kind of split in terms of what to do about South Vietnam. There are more hawkish folks who want more and more troops to counter the worsening political and military situation, and then there are those who we would call more dovish, who want to use diplomacy. JFK opts for something in between. He increases financial aid, and he provides military advisors who go in and support the South Vietnamese military, though sometimes they do more than that. Now, many within Kennedy's administration wanted to go even further, and after Kennedy's assassination, there are certainly many who believe that we need to do more to step in and support South Vietnam. And we just sort of need an excuse, and that excuse comes with something called the attack or the incident at the Gulf of Tonkin. Basically, there is a report that there is an attack by the North Vietnamese or Vietnamese communists on a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin that you can see on this map towards the north here. Now, later investigations make it clear that this event probably never took place, but nevertheless, the reports of it are able to get Congress to move ahead and approve military involvement. And so at this point, the U.S. is not only supporting a regime with financial assistance, with military advisors, but we're now actually directly involved in a war. And moving forward, we're using a combination of Air Force and ground troops in order to fight Vietnamese communists in both the North and the South. We have airstrikes of North and South Vietnamese villages that are thought to have been harboring Viet Cong, which is a word that we start to use for Vietnamese communists. And we have the ground troops on the ground in a very challenging situation. To quote, I think this is David Halberstam, who wrote at the time in 1962, it is often impossible to separate the cruel and dedicated foe you want to kill from the simple and illiterate peasant you want to woo. I may have had the date wrong there, but I think I have the a general point here, which is that it is very challenging in a war like this to tell the people we're fighting from the people we're saving. And Vietnamese communists at this time are fighting a guerrilla war. We would love to fight them out in the open fields, in more traditional battle, but that's not what's going to happen. The warfare is going to take place in the densely forested jungles. It's going to take place, in tunnels underground. It's going to take place in villages. It's going to take place in places that are harder for us to take advantage of our military superiority and our financial superiority. Add to that Vietnam is brutally hot, and brutally hot and moist is a combination that leads to insects that make life miserable, and around every corner potentially could be another Viet Cong fighter who is ready to attack U.S. troops. And if your goal as the U.S. is the peaceful establishment of a friendly regime, how are you going to do it? I mean, one way to get victory, I guess, would be to kill all of the Vietnamese communists. And certainly the U.S. kills a lot more Vietnamese than the Vietnamese killed the U.S. in the course of the Vietnam War. However, they're going to keep coming. I mean, these are people defending their homeland. It's going to be very hard to kill all of them. And the other way to do it is to win hearts and minds, is convince them that this U.S.-supported regime is going to be for the best. Well, this is going to be hard to do if you are very often in the fields fighting wars against people that, in some cases, might be the family members of the very people who you're trying to woo. In fact, might be the same people you're trying to woo. We are in a very hard position, one might say, or alternately, you might say that, the government has created a very challenging job for its army to pull off. For these reasons, a growing number of people in America grew increasingly distrustful of the war effort. They criticized whether it was a good idea. they criticize it at a much deeper level as sometimes immoral. However, as we'll learn in class, I think there's a lot of different types of anti-war sentiment, and we can't sometimes think of anti-war sentiment in a certain mold. We associate with the hippies, we associate it with the staunchest anti-war activists, and what I'm going to argue in class is that we have to have a more complex portrait, because there's a wide range of anti-war sentiment, and it's over a wide range of groups of people in society. And we'll talk about that in class.